Fear. One of the truly universal components of humanity. No matter your race, your gender, your orientation, your creed, your religion, put all that aside, because everyone has something they are afraid of. Some people are able to grow past these fears, while others unfortunately are afflicted with them for life. And one of the most common types of severe fears, otherwise known as phobias, are, well, just as equally severe. And that has to do with the weather. I would know. I grew up with a massive, debilitating fear of thunderstorms for a decent chunk of my childhood, up until I was about 13 or 14. I will get into my personal story in bits and pieces throughout this video, but right now I want to just talk about how strange it is that we don't talk about this sort of stuff more often. Because if you look up how common are weather phobias, the answer is pretty surprising. Multiple sources state that 1 in 10 people in the United States have a weather-related phobia. Now, this is a very flashy number, but personally, I feel like more research needs to be done into this. That's not to say I doubt that the actual statistic is in this ballpark. My problem is the sample size was only around 300 people. I know you can't go and interview every American in the country, but 300 people out of 334 million people is nothing. I also have been having trouble finding the original paper itself. I can only find it referenced offhandedly in the articles I linked down below that I used in this video. So, numbers aside though, what is a weather phobia? According to Johns Hopkins University, a phobia is an uncontrollable, irrational, and a lasting fear of a certain object, situation, or activity. Harvard Health adds onto this definition by stating a phobia is a persistent, excessive, or unrealistic fear of an object, person, animal, activity, or situation. So before I get into some of the most common weather phobias, you may already see a potential contradiction here in the minds of the people who fear these things. For people suffering from weather phobias, it can be very difficult to draw the line between what fear feels excessive or unrealistic. As an adult, I could see how my reaction as a child was an overreaction. When I was at home, I would try and hide away from the outside world, even hours in advance of the storm coming. When it would come over, I was just paralyzed with fear. I would stop what I was doing. I wouldn't enjoy my life anymore. But even as an adult, I have some degree of trouble with saying that the fear basis was fully irrational. Because depending on the phobia, you can't really say there isn't some degree of valid fear there. For example, lolapsophobia, which is the fear of hurricanes or tornadoes. I'm sure these fears can manifest themselves in many different ways, but I don't think anyone is going to argue here that experiencing a hurricane or a tornado isn't a frightening experience. I would assume the more irrational end of this fear would come from the constant monitoring of weather, just in case of a hurricane or a tornado, even if conditions obviously don't warrant one existing right now. Monitoring every little storm cell, every little cluster of storms out in the ocean. Maybe for someone living in a coastal state, once a tropical storm forms out in the water, they become constantly paranoid that it'll impact them, even if the forecasts say otherwise, that it's going to landfall hundreds of miles away. This is the type of things that anxiety does to the brain. In addition to that, there's a common psychological component that I personally believe has been missing from the weather phobia equation, and that's the concept of trauma. Traumatic events are often the precursors to things like post-traumatic stress disorder, and one of the most common types of traumatic event are natural disasters. I bring this up because I believe this missing link actually affected my treatment as a child. I'm not a psychologist, so don't take this as gospel. I'm just speaking from my standpoint and using what I do know about psychology. So when I first went to therapy for my phobia, astrophobia, or the fear of thunder and lightning, I went for a few weeks, and it did help a pretty decent amount, but I also believe that I was already beginning to grow out of the fear a little bit. I was 14 years old at the time, and I had learned how to overall rationalize better. I knew that if I was inside during storms, I was safe. There was no reason to hide or shut down. I could just keep living my life. So by the time I was 18, I would say most of the fear was gone. For example, I used to dread seeing thunderstorm days in the forecast, days in advance, praying that the forecast would change because I just didn't want to deal with thunderstorms. Now at 21, I look forward to it, so I can make content for this channel and watch it all unfold. But unfortunately, it's not all sunshine and roses. I do still have some sort of inert response to severe weather. My body and my mind do still tense up when I go near or especially get into thunderstorms, even if I'm trying to be positive. That's why you may hear me tense up or gasp slightly when I get surprised by lightning in the recordings. Or sometimes I say something and I just sound kind of panicked and tensed, like this. Even though I feel okay, like I'm not worried, my subconscious mind is like screaming at me on the inside that something is just wrong. I was in and out of therapy between the ages of 18 and 21 for non-weather phobia issues, but the phobia itself was still a major talking point regardless because, it did really impact me in my childhood. But in that regard, the consensus quickly changed from what I was diagnosed with as a child, from generalized anxiety and astrophobia. Because what used to be a debilitating phobia had become more of just a circumstantial trigger caused by a past event, which sounds a lot more like post-traumatic stress disorder. What people didn't understand about me by the time I was a teen is that a lot of the fear was gone. Like, a lot of the anticipatory fear was gone. But when, like a lightning bolt, for example, would strike, I would still panic, even though I was fine. And I wasn't able to explain why. And I don't mean I just got, like, a little jumpy in the moment. Everyone jumps at loud claps of thunder. I mean, like, it would actively stress me out, like, way more than it should have. And it would last long after, like, the initial trigger. So, my personal theory behind this change in diagnosis is that in 2017, the DSM-5 came out. This is basically the Dictionary of Mental Health and Psychiatric Disorders. In this new issue of the DSM, a new category of disorders were made: trauma and stressor-related disorders. And under this new definition, specific stressors were considered less like fears and phobias, though those do still exist, and more as their own class of disorder. Remember, before 2017, things like PTSD were considered more in line with general anxiety disorders. As someone who has been through treatment for both, you don't tackle general anxiety the same way you do PTSD. Whether it's a phobia, fear, post-traumatic stress disorder, another psychiatric disorder, whatever it may be, the feelings are all still very real to the people who experience them and are more than just their labels. However you put it, it all comes down to a common thread. Typically, a person will experience or see something devastating that's related to the weather. Other people may have been through a very intense situation directly relating to the weather where no harm was done but the perceived threat left a scar. This is what I believe happened to me. When I was 4 years old, my family was moving down from New York to Florida. We were flying and apparently went through a massive thunderstorm. While everything ended up alright in the end, it was a very frightening experience. I don't personally remember it because that's so long ago and I can barely remember what I ate for dinner 2 nights ago. But I can only imagine how the perceived threat of death would impact a 4-year-old, and my parents quickly noticed my behavior relating to the weather change after this event. But it also created a bit of a paradox. I was scared of the weather, but also fascinated by it. I was so scared that I wanted to learn everything I could so I knew how to keep myself and the people around me safe. That fear helped spark a passion, which is why I am at peace with the fact I had to live through that phobia, no matter how much pain it caused me. Unfortunately, though, not everyone naturally grows out of their phobias. In these situations, one of the most common methods to try and help these individuals is exposure therapy, basically slowly exposing them to more and more of their fear, but in a safe, controlled environment. When treating weather phobias, this often involves showing photos or videos of whatever weather stimuli frightens the patient and helping them work through their feelings of fear with a psychologist. This may sound counterintuitive and like it could be triggering, but in a safe environment with someone that can analyze the situation, they can help calm this person down and also get to the root of why they feel this way. So now that we have a healthy understanding of what phobias are and how severe weather can lead to them, let's take a look at some of the most common weather phobias. These are going to be relatively quick because most of them are self-explanatory by definition, but here we go. Also, no particular order on these. So, first up we have astrophobia, or the fear of thunder and lightning. The fear is one of the most common phobias in general, even outside of weather-related phobias. It appears to occur mostly in children, with many outgrowing the fear by teenage years or adulthood. Personally, I was more scared of the lightning itself, as that's the part that actually poses a danger. However, the sound of thunder was, and to a degree still is, a trigger to me. Though I do think that rationalizing this fear is easier on average compared to things like tornadoes or hurricanes. With lightning, most of the time you're pretty safe if you're indoors and away from windows. But with tornadoes and hurricanes, that's not really a guarantee at all. Speaking of which, lapsophobia, which is the fear of tornadoes and hurricanes. I find it strange that this phobia bunches together both hurricanes and tornadoes, as they are two completely different beasts, which I could see spiraling out in two very different directions. But regardless, this is probably one of the most easy to understand fears. I've never seen a tornado in person personally, but I have seen a few hurricanes, and the anxiety leading up to the storms landfall is immensely high. I remember Hurricane Ian last year. That was incredibly stressful. That's before you even have to actually sit there and ride out the storm. And the thought that a storm could just form, drop a tornado, and ruin your life in a matter of minutes, yeah, that's a terrifying thought to anyone. But people with this phobia often over-exaggerate what is a rational fear, honestly, through no fault of their own. Often in days where storms flare, these individuals will already be panicking long before anything has happened, if anything even ends up happening at all. Quick side note I wanted to make here, a lot of the people I know, and myself included, that had weather phobias often end up being interested in the weather itself, and even if they're not, often photos and videos do not trigger them, like, directly. Or at least it does not trigger them to the same extent that, like, actually being near that event would. And I think that's part of why exposure therapy is used. But, I just wanted to clarify for anyone that's confused, like, okay, you know, why then do I see these people who claim they're afraid of storms? Why do they love watching weather videos? Well, that's probably why. Because, like I said, I kind of had that weird paradox where I became interested while also being scared, and I think that was a very common experience among my generation, especially because of the internet and TV shows on the Weather Channel and things like that. It just became so common and so easy to access this information that it was a fear that we were able to fight, for the most part, in my opinion. Anchorophobia is the fear of the wind. And from my reading, I had trouble finding out to what degree this often occurs at, and by that I mean I would assume most with this phobia are concerned about stronger winds usually, winds that can actually cause harm by flinging debris or knocking things over. But I am sure that in certain severe cases it can even be a gentle breeze triggering someone, but from what I can find, it seems to be more in line with severe winds. Like, probably if I had to guess, like, I doubt that there's a certain number to it, but like 20 plus miles per hour where things are actually going flying and things like that, you know? Umbrophobia is the fear of the rain. This sometimes gets mistaken for astrophobia, as some people think that heavy rain also just means thunder and lightning. Many people initially thought I was scared of the rain, but that's actually not the case at all. Even during the height of my astrophobia, I loved heavy rain, as long as there was no thunder and lightning with it. Again, I don't really know to what degree the fear typically kicks in for sufferers of this condition. I would assume this is usually in relation to heavier rain that can cause severe flooding or damage similar to the last entry with the wind. But, similarly to the previous phobias I've mentioned on this list, even the forecast of flooding rains likely spurs dread for sufferers of ombrophobia. Cyanophobia is the fear of the snow. This is one I have trouble empathizing with on a personal level, as I haven't seen snow in nearly 2 decades down here, but I can understand why this could be scary. Snow looks innocent enough, and it's often one of the more gentle forms of precipitation, or at least that's how it's generally perceived. But snowstorms and blizzards are no joke at all, as we saw back in Texas during their February 2021 winter storm. Though, it does seem that the fear often lies less with the flakes itself and more so the dangerous conditions that heavy snow can create, like on the roads, or just in general around the house. Last up on the list we have nephophobia, or the fear of the clouds. I was initially only going to list off of 5 of the most common phobias, but I wanted to include this one because I think it portrays a point I want to make very well. When people think of individuals with weather phobias, they often expect them to go off at the slightest trigger, but this is often not the case. They may also have very baseline understanding on why an individual with a weather phobia is scared, which is okay. Because you heard that definition I read, and I'm sure at least one person thought something along the lines of, why would you be afraid of the clouds? And that's a reasonable question to ask. But just like with the last couple examples, it's often not the object itself. It's not the raindrops that make people with ombrophobia scared. It's the fact that, en masse, these raindrops can cause destruction in the form of flooding, usually. Here, it's not the clouds themselves necessarily that they are often scared of, it's that some clouds can be indicators of nasty weather. In some cases, nephophobia can be misconstrued as another weather phobia, or maybe the prelude to severe weather phobia itself. Human psychology is a fascinating subject, and one of my favorites, but everyone reacts to things differently. If anything I said in this video comes off as insensitive to those who experience weather phobias, I want to assure you that that is not my intent. I've lived with it for most of my life. I experienced negativity and disrespect because of my phobia on numerous occasions. I would never want to pass that pain along deliberately. If you or someone you know believes they are experiencing negative repercussions in life due to a weather phobia, do not hesitate to seek mental health counseling. I remember when I went to therapy again at 18, and I was thinking to myself, man, the doctor is going to think I'm crazy for being afraid of thunderstorms. I guarantee you they've heard things like that a million times. And on top of that, therapists have to hear a lot of things that aren't related to the weather, so I'm willing to bet money your fear of a weather phenomena is nowhere near as ridiculous as some of the things they've heard. But even then, in my humble opinion, nothing you need to bring up to a therapist is ridiculous at all. We all have feelings, and we are all humans. Sometimes we just need somebody to hear us out. And with that, I hope as the spotlight is beginning to be shown more on mental health, that individuals who suffered and who continue to suffer through weather phobias like I did can be heard and hopefully feel more understood in this world. I hope you learned something new from this video, and if you did, please leave a like and subscribe, share it to your friends. I hope you all have a good day. Please stay safe out there.